This video is all about painting a landscape for the beginner. If you're looking at this painting now and thinking this is difficult, this is the perfect video for you because I'm going to walk you through all the steps to show you that it's not as hard as you might think. One of the foundations in painting landscapes is understanding gradients. A gradient in painting is a transition from a lighter area to a darker area. Adding these transitions to our skies and our foreground are going to help give us some depth and perspective to our image. We're also going to be talking about some of the fundamentals in landscape painting, such as basic linear perspective and horizon line. As we combine multiple techniques such as gradients, linear perspective, and others, we're going to help ourselves paint a more convincing image. And finally, in order to simplify some things, we're going to be using some dramatic lighting to help us out and some silhouettes, since we're almost looking directly into the light source. On the screen now, I'm placing a full-size image of this completed painting. You can pause the video here and use this as your reference. On your canvas, you're going to want to draw two things. The first is a horizontal line toward the bottom of the page. This is the horizon line, which separates the sky from the ground. Next, you're going to draw two lines from the bottom of the page that meet together on the horizon line. Where these 2 points intersect, we get a spot that's called the vanishing point. And the purpose of this is basic linear perspective. It basically shows us a path that starts large, and as it gets farther away, it gets smaller and smaller, creating the illusion of distance and depth in our painting. I also like to block in the major shapes in a drawing, so I recommend drawing in the trunk of the tree and also this cast shadow on the left. On the right side of the canvas, we could also block in these larger areas where these bushes are. So with those very simple forms added onto our canvas, we're going to use those as guides to help us in the painting. So let's get started with it. With the trunk of my tree drawn out, I'm going to lay some Frisket film on top of it. My favorite brand of Frisket film is made by Art Tool just because it comes in a large roll, and I'll have a link for that down below. I'm using smooth canvas that I prepared myself for this painting, but you could also use airbrush paper. I have links down below in the video description showing you how to make both of those. Once the Frisket film is applied to the canvas, I'm going to use my X-Acto blade just like I would a pencil. So what I'm doing here is going over my major outlines or contours just to cut out the basic shapes like the trunk and some of the larger branches. You could draw branches any way you like. There's a lot of room for error here. This is not like a portrait where everything has to be perfect, but I recommend using the reference I gave in the beginning of this video to help you out. Using Frisket film with airbrushing is a very common technique because it helps give you sharp lines, helps eliminate any of that overspray. And we'll talk about other techniques as we get further along in this video. But what I'm doing here is I'm using some painter's tape to mask off the edges of this Frisket film, basically making like a little dam so none of that overspray can get on the blank parts of the canvas. Since we're looking almost directly into the light source of this painting, this tree is going to be in silhouette, meaning it's going to be basically pure black. So using black by Createx Illustration Colors, I'm going to spray this directly over the Frisket. And now this color hasn't been diluted, I'm spraying it right out of the bottle. I'm using an Iwata Micron here, spraying at 20 psi. You could use any airbrush you'd like for this painting. When working with Frisket, the airbrush is not the important part, it's the way you use it. So what I like to do is spray the smallest amount. So demonstrating here on an Iwata Eclipse, you can see that I pull back the airbrush just a tiny bit. Pulling the trigger back a small amount is all you need to get the airbrush to start spraying. And this is very important when you're painting on Frisket because if you add too much, it's going to get underneath the Frisket and you're not going to get nice clean lines. So here's an example of what you don't want to do. You don't want to pull the trigger back this far because what's going to happen is you're going to flood the image with paint. Just make sure you have your compressor set to 20 psi and you add the paint very slowly to the canvas. Painting is all about exercising patience, so make sure you don't rush with this. So obviously this part of the video is sped up to save time, but as you can see here in about 5 minutes of painting, once I remove the Frisket film, I get nice sharp lines for the tree trunk and some of the branches. The reason I decided to paint the tree first instead of the background like the sky is because this is going to give me a little bit more room for error, meaning that if I make any mistakes on this tree, I can use my eraser to pull this out without worrying about erasing some of the sky if we painted that in first. There's no rules in painting. You can paint any way you like. I just figured with painting this tree first, it'll be a little bit easier for beginners. And if you don't like how your tree came out, if you're working on smooth canvas, you can erase the whole tree using some 4012 reducer or some Windex and a paper towel and just wipe it right off. Now in order to paint some of the smaller branches, I'm putting the airbrush to the side and switching over to a black Prismacolor pencil. I'm going to be resting my hand on the canvas here so you can see I put down a blank piece of paper just to protect the paint underneath. So with the colored pencil, I'm using this to add in some small branches between some of the thicker ones. It's going to make the tree look a little bit more full. Now with this part, you can kind of have fun with this. You don't have to get crazy and try to get every single branch perfect from a reference photo. All you want to do is kind of fill out the tree. And if you're new to painting, you don't have to add in all these small branches. You could just stick with a few of the larger ones and make it a much simpler tree, because what's nice about this, like we talked about before, is that this is all in silhouette, so you don't have to worry about any highlights or shading on it. You're basically just painting in the trunk and the branches with pure black paint. Now over on the left side of the tree, I want to add some more of these thicker branches in, so I'm switching back to some Frisket, and I'm using my X-Acto blade to cut out some branches. While I'm doing this, I'm trying to make my branches thicker as they're closer to the tree or to the trunk of the tree, and as they move farther away, they just get skinnier and skinnier. But using my X-Acto blade here, I'm basically just drawing with it. It may be a good idea to practice on a blank piece of paper before you actually go into your canvas, just so you get a sense of what you want for your tree. And because it's a lesson for beginners, you could really stop wherever you'd like on this tree. Sometimes a simpler image is a better one. Now, if you're using Frisket film and an X-Acto blade, you're going to learn pretty quickly that this is very time consuming. So another option you have is to use a very thin paintbrush. The type of paintbrush I'm using here is a script liner brush, which is very similar to a pinstriping brush. Now this one is a size 0 made by Kafka. Instead of using the black paint through the airbrush, I can apply some of it to a disposable palette, and then I can use my paintbrush to paint in the branches. You could adjust the thickness of your line by how much pressure you apply to the paintbrush. If you're using a paintbrush, you're going to notice that this is a lot faster, and you don't have to go through all the steps of applying the Frisket and cutting it out. The only problem with this, though, is that it's way less forgiving. Once you put down the paint with this, it's really stuck there because you apply way more paint onto the surface with the brush than you do with an airbrush, because in airbrush you slowly add it on, and with Frisket you could decide if you want to adjust it or change it. You basically see everything before you put down the paint. With a paintbrush, once you put it down, it's going to stay there. So like with most things in art, there's plenty of ways to approach this. If you decide to use some Frisket film and an airbrush, you're definitely going to get sharper lines and you'll get them more precise. The only downside is that it's going to take way longer. Now, in my personal opinion, I think it's best to try different techniques because we're all so different. We have different ways that we want to approach something. So if you try different techniques, you're eventually going to settle on one that you think is best for your painting style. That's why I think it's so important to learn from different teachers, study from different artists throughout art history. And if you're watching videos on YouTube, switch through different artists. The most dangerous thing to think in any form of creating art is that there's one way or there's a right way. Because in my experience, I notice that I'm always changing my techniques and I'm always trying to evolve, trying to improve, also trying to make it easier on myself. So experimenting is absolutely the way to go in art. Try different techniques and don't be scared about making mistakes. That's one of the biggest things. Fear is going to hold you back if you're nervous about, screwing up, but don't be. Just understand that's always going to be part of it. Mistakes are not a big deal, and you'll continue on. You'll just improve from it and you'll learn and get better. On the right side of the canvas, we're going to start adding in some of those bushes, but before I do that, I want to add some twigs or some branches, some things going on in the background. This way it gives us two different textures. You're going to see when we paint those bushes in, or basically the clumps of trees together, it looks like one large bush. It's going to be very soft, so it's good to have some sharper details behind it. So just in the background here, a few twigs and a few branches. So as these branches move toward the ground, they're kind of clumping together and they're getting darker because they're in silhouette. So what we're going to do is we're just going to use some pure black and we're just going to fill in this whole area very softly. Now, if you were painting a more advanced landscape and you're adding in foliage like this, you'd probably go for more detail. You'd add more subtle shadows and some highlights so you could see leaves growing out of it and some branches, whatever you want to make it look more realistic. But since this one is for the beginner, we're going to simplify it, and just using this black paint is really going to help us create that impression of foliage growing off back into the distance. In landscape painting, objects farther away from us are generally lighter in value than objects closer to us. This is going to help create the impression of depth in a painting. So on this one, we're just going to stick with this dark value up in the front, and we're going to mix a lighter value to move along toward the back of it. So I'm mixing a lighter value of black using some white to the mixture, which I'm going to put on the screen right now. And with this, we're going to use this to spray in the back of this foliage. Now what I'm doing here is I'm taking a piece of ripped paper and I'm using this as a guide. What this is going to do is give me kind of an organic edge to the outlines of this. So if I use like a ruler or a French curve, the edge would be way too sharp. So I'm basically using this to kind of define my edges, but still keep them relatively soft. Since this part is farther away from us, we don't want to add too much detail to it. We want to look like it's kind of blurring away as it moves off in the distance. So I'm just going to use this color to lightly spray this in, and I can come in later with an eraser to define some of the edges, maybe make it look a little bit more organic, like some sticks are growing out of the foliage or the shrubs, something to make it look a little bit more like something you'd see in nature. I think the key here is subtlety. You want to keep everything kind of soft, but I'm going to add some detail here because these look a little bit too round to me. So I have a Dremel tool here with an eraser in it, and I'm just pulling out some highlights here. Like I said before, something to make it look like some branches growing out of it. From here, I'm going to add some branches into the background of this just using my airbrush. When you spray with an airbrush, your lines are naturally going to be soft since it's atomizing and spraying the paint. So this will work well for something in the background because it's going to give these branches kind of a blurry look. When we painted the tree in the foreground using Frisket, we get very sharp, defined lines. That looks good if you want something that looks like it's closer to you or that it's in sharp focus. When you just paint with the airbrush, like these lines in the background here, they're going to look very soft and they're going to look kind of blurry and almost out of focus. So it's good to kind of play around with the different textures, something sharp, so using Frisket or a brush in the foreground, and as we move away and things start to get blurrier, we switch to just using the airbrush. I'm still using the same color here, which is that mixture of black and white to give us a slightly lighter version of a black color. And we could also adjust the value of this by how much we spray. So just like I showed you before in the beginning of this video, I'm just pulling back the tiniest bit on the airbrush trigger. I don't want to pull too much because that's going to flood it with paint and it's also going to make it much darker. So just nice and light to pull these lines out. And once I have this in, I'm going to switch to pure black and lightly spray it over the left side of this because that's going to be closer to the viewer, so closer to the foreground, and we want that a little bit darker than anything else in the background. Now as we move to the left side of the painting, we're going to switch back to our lighter black color that we mixed, and we're going to lightly spray over the horizon line using a ripped piece of paper. Now I try to rip this paper as straight as I can, and it's going to give us those nice little imperfections that kind of make it look like an organic edge. And if I lightly spray this over the horizon line, I'm going to get shapes that look like trees very far away that are out of focus and kind of blurry. If you make any mistakes, it's no big deal. You could just switch over to your eraser like I'm doing here and use that to either clean up edges or erase a section and rework it. Now I'm switching over to the underside of this piece of paper so I have a sharp edge, and I'm just laying in parallel lines along the bottom of this. This is going to give us some layers of different values to make it look like separations of maybe fields or something going on in the background. Now after I have a few of these lines in, I'm going to switch to freehand just to lay a small amount of paint on the canvas here. This is going to give me something to work with. So after we have a thin layer of paint down, I'm going to switch over to an eraser. I'm going to pull out some horizontal lines, making sure to keep these parallel to the horizon line. This is going to break up and just add some texture to the fields here. Now while I'm working on this as well, I'm just going to make up some small trees or bushes growing in the background. This is going to break up the flatness of it, and again we're just kind of adding some texture to it, making it look like there's something back there, but we're not going into a lot of detail with it, right? This is far in the background, so the atmosphere is kind of blurring it out, so we're keeping it soft. And as we move from the background up to the foreground, I'm just going to add some more of this paint in. And I'm going to spray it slightly darker here. Again, trying to follow that rule with landscapes that things are closer to us are going to be darker or a higher value. And as they move away, they generally get lighter. Now let's mix a transparent color for the sky, starting with some orange by Createx Illustration Colors and some burnt umber. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix about 10-15 drops of orange to about 5 or 6 drops burnt umber. It's usually easier to spray your paint if it's thinner, so you could use some 40-12 reducer or do what I do and just use some distilled water. So I generally thin around 15-20%, somewhere in that range, generally having it slightly thicker than whole milk. So we're just going to mix this up, and you're going to see we're going to get a color that looks like this, kind of a brownish orange. And this is going to work perfect for the sky. This color now is 100% transparent, meaning there's no white in it, so we could spray this right over the trees and the bushes that we put in the foreground. Switching back to my airbrush and spraying at around 20 psi, I'm going to very slowly spray this over the background. Now, this color is transparent, meaning that the more we spray, the darker it's going to get. So this part's going to be challenging for new painters. What you're going to have to do is very slowly and evenly try to add the paint to your canvas. I'm going to be speeding this part of the video up because this is a very slow process, but right here I'm showing you in real time how slowly I actually add this paint. I'm starting right in the middle of the canvas, right over the tree, and lightly spraying it. And once I put something down, I stop for a second, look at it, and then decide if I want to add some more or I want to start continuing further along on the canvas. I usually hold my airbrush around 6 to 8 inches away from the canvas when spraying a background in, and just like before, I'm just pulling back a tiny hair pull on the trigger and just lightly getting this paint on. And now something that's annoying with acrylic paint that I never hear anyone really talk about is that when you paint with acrylic paint, as soon as you put it on and the paint's still wet, the color is going to be lighter, and as it dries, it's going to get darker. If you ever painted your house or any of the walls, those are acrylic paints as well, and you'll notice that when you put the color on, it's light, and as it dries, it gets slightly darker, but almost like a full value it drops. This is because inside acrylic paint, there's a binder, an acrylic polymer, that while it's wet, it looks opaque. It kind of looks like a white color, and if you mix white with any color, it's going to lighten it, right? And as that polymer dries, it's going to become clear, and that's going to make the color darker. So this is something that I'll definitely talk about in another video. It gets more advanced, but without worrying about what's going on, just remember that when you put a paint on, it's going to look slightly lighter, and as it dries, it's going to get darker. This is kind of an annoying thing that happens with acrylic paint, but you get used to it in time, and with practice you'll start to accept this and just know where it's going to go. So I'm going to speed this clip up so this video is not an hour long, and you can see this probably took me about 10-15 minutes to paint in the whole thing, but just like I showed you in the beginning part of this, I'm just going very, very slow and just trying to get the values on as evenly as possible. You're never going to get it absolutely perfect. Some areas are going to be slightly darker, but just do the best you can to try to keep an even spray and lightly cover this whole area. As you move closer to the horizon line, the sky is generally going to get lighter in value, so try to spray less paint toward the bottom. And as you move up to the middle section, try to keep it a little bit darker. And don't worry if any overspray gets on the ground, because we're going to be using that anyway, because the ground is always going to be reflecting parts of the sky. So I walked away from my canvas for about 10-15 minutes and let that first layer dry. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the exact same paint right into the airbrush, and I'm going to try to darken this value up. Again, always going slowly, building these values up bit by bit. As I apply the second coat of this paint, I'm trying to add more toward the middle of the canvas, and I'm trying to leave out the paint toward the bottom as we get to that horizon line. You could also see on the right side of the canvas, I'm leaving it blank, because as the color goes toward the sun, that sky is going to shift from an orange to a yellow, so I'll eventually spray over that with a yellow color later on, but for now, just leave it blank. I decided I want to break up some of the orange in the sky, so in the top left corner I put in blue violet, that's by Createx Illustration Colors. I didn't dilute it, I used it directly from the bottle, and I just sprayed it in on this top left corner with a gradient, so slightly darker toward the top, and as I go further into the orange I use less. Just a note, you have to be careful when mixing complementary colors. Blue and orange are on opposite sides of the color wheel, so if you mix those together, you may get a grayish color, but it seemed to work here just fine, so we're going to leave it, move on to the next part. On the right side of the canvas, we're going to have to add some of these bushes or shrubs that are in the background, and we want them out of focus, but also the light is going to be affecting them a little bit differently because this is where the sun's going to be setting. So here I'm using pure burnt umber in my airbrush and lightly spraying it in. Again, this is going to be in the background like the other part that we worked on before, and when something's in the background, we kind of want it out of focus and not too much detail in it. So I'm just lightly spraying this in, knowing that I'll darken it up later, but just using burnt umber like this, we're going to get this very dark orange, kind of brownish color. I'm going to continue with this color over here where the road ends, kind of in the vanishing point spot. And we're just going to add some textures back here to make it look like some bushes or trees that are very far away. So as these shrubs get closer to us, we want to make them darker. So I'm switching to black by Createx Illustration Colors, and this is transparent black, and just lightly spraying this over the bottom of it, trying not to flood the canvas with paint, just lightly putting it on and darkening the values up. Now I want to blend out some of the tops of these trees, so I'm switching to white. It's an opaque white, and just lightly spraying it over the top of this. Generally, you're going to get a slight shift toward a gray bluish tone, but that's okay because we're going to be spraying over that with some orange later, and it'll knock it back down. So the last thing we're going to do for this part of the tutorial is finish up the sky toward the upper right section of the canvas. Now this is where the sun's going to be setting. So what we're going to do is we're going to shift the color from an orange over to a yellow. This is a gradient. It's also going to lighten the value from a darker to a lighter color. So you can see here I'm just using yellow by Createx Illustration Color and spraying it in the top right corner of this canvas, trying to leave out that very, very top right corner, just basically leaving that pure white because that's going to be our sun. Once I have that yellow color laid down, I'm going to switch back to that premixed orange we made, and I'm going to start blending this yellow into that orange that we added in before. That's going to help give a nice smooth gradient. So at the bottom here, you can see I'm adding in some clouds, kind of like some clouds that are coming over the lower part of the sky there, and just lightly trying to blend these two together. And what we're getting here is a smooth gradient. This is going to help us look like we created the illusion of a sky. The bright section is up in that right corner where the sun is setting, and then as we move further down toward the bottom, we're going to get darker areas where the clouds are. Just try to do the best you can to blend this orange into that yellow so you have a nice seamless transition. So that's going to complete the first part of this lesson. I hope you enjoyed this. In the next part, we're going to switch down to the foreground, and I'm going to show you how to add some basic textures. Just like this first part, it's going to be very simple. A lot of the stuff we're going to be making up as we go along, but we're going to get a nice, pretty good realistic looking landscape that's not difficult to do. So again, I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.